Today we're going to learn about how engines work. And the easiest way to do that is to look at a simple single-cylinder engine like this one. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take this engine apart, look at all the stuff inside, and learn how all the parts work together. This is an overview video, but we're also going to do some detailed videos that cover things that I only touch on today. And for some areas, we'll go really deep and do what I call nerd level videos. First question might be though, why even learn about an engine like this? You know, today's day and age, cars are going electric, everything's going electric. Why would I want to know about this stuff? Well, the thing is, I mean, if you look at this, just about any physical phenomenon that you would study in a engineering or technical field happens inside an engine like this. And the beauty of the engine also is that if you know how this one works, then you pretty much know how any engine works. And you're talking about, you know, in a car engine with 8 cylinders, 12 cylinders, 4 cylinders, whatever. It's all the same stuff. It's a marvel of engineering. You're going to find out that how they actually made this thing affordable. I mean, just to think about how far they've come. I mean, they're still making these things better. So anyway, let's get started. We want to think about, with any machine or device, what's the end goal? For these, for an engine, basically, it's to turn something. Okay, so you got this is an output shaft here. This thing could be put on a generator. It could be put on, you know, a lawnmower. It could be really anything. But basically, you're trying to turn something. So we're going to actually look at, you know, from that first goal, how do you get the rest of this junk? And the easiest way to think about it actually is thinking about a bicycle. When you're riding a bike, your legs going up and down, and that's rotating a gear, that rotates a chain, that rotates the wheel. And this engine kind of works the same way. This thing here, you're going to find there's what's called the crankshaft inside, and that has something in here called a piston going up and down. The piston is like the leg going up and down, and that gets translated to rotating motion and turns this shaft here. So that piston I mentioned rides inside a cylinder. So this is kind of a little bit of a weird engine here because it's got a, well, not weird, but it's just, you know, sometimes they're usually vertical or horizontal, but this has the cylinder at an angle. All right, air comes in here, fuel comes in from the fuel tank, of course, and goes into what's called the carburetor, which I'll show you later. There's a spark plug here. It's hard to see up in there. We'll see that once we take it apart. And the spark plug is there to set off a flame inside the engine that drives the piston. So it basically sucks in air here, drinks in the fuel from the tank, burns it inside, and then it comes out in the exhaust and leaves. All right, first things first. We'll take a look at the air system here. So we take that cover off. This is a air filter. This is sort of cheap, but does the job. It's just a piece of foam in this case. They can be made of many things. There's paper element filters. There's all types. And here you can see there's an inlet to what's called the carburetor, which we're going to get into. So I'm going to take this is basically the air filter holder off. All right, so this is the carburetor here. This is a very cool thing. I mean, it's like, you know, any car you're driving today that has a gas engine is not going to have a carburetor. It's going to have, well, unless if you drive an old car today. But any modern car today has fuel injection, which we'll talk about in one of the detailed videos. When it became necessary to get fuel efficiency, really the emissions cleaner, the carburetors just couldn't really swing it anymore. So we'll start taking this apart. Take this apart, we got to disconnect the fuel line. Squeezes that, pull it up off there. There we go. Back to our gas tank, you know, the gas tank, hopefully you get that concept right. It's, you know, you got the cap, you throw the gas in there. It's got a little strainer in this one too, which is always nice. Make sure you don't get a bunch of dirt in there and stuff. There's also, at the outlet, there's usually another strainer that keeps fuel from dirt getting inside. Because what you're going to find in the carburetor is that there's a bunch of little tiny ports and stuff. So you get a little bit of dirt in there, it's like, you know, you gotta fix it. You gotta take it apart. It's game over for the day. It's kind of like the kidney stone for the engine. Just gonna disconnect the linkage here, and should be able to pull the carburetor off after that. So here we go. Boop, boop, boop. This is the carburetor. Like, you know, years of development in this thing. Probably not this one, but, you know, years of development to get these things to where they are. Well, we'll get to the carburetor later. What I actually want to do is open the engine up a little bit more so you actually can see. All right. Take off this muffler. So it's a little bit, so this is an old trick. I don't know. I guess it's not really proper, but I've done it my whole life. Get a little poor man's bar on there to get a little more leverage. Okay, here we got the muffler, the gasket, and usually on our get to nerd level, this is like a kind of a metallic crushable for high temperature stuff. So now we got on this engine here, we got the intake over here, little gasket there with the long bolts for the carburetor, and we got the exhaust port over here. And this is it's hard to tell yet, but this is a overhead valve engine, OHV, overhead valve, and the cylinder's probably coming up to, well, about here, because I can see the cylinder head here, ending here, or beginning here, I should say. So one thing to note is that most every engine on like a lawnmower and that kind of thing is air cooled. You know, in the car you have a radiator, you've probably heard of that. That's because it's a liquid cooled engine where basically air cools liquid in the radiator that then runs through the engine. But on an air cooled engine, literally air just blows over the engine, over these fins. These fins are here to help dissipate the heat as the air passes over it. Those are used to cool the engine. So on the front of the engine, or you see here, there's, you know, obviously this big black cover on here, and we'll dig inside there, and what you're going to find is that there's a flywheel, a fan, that actually blows air over the engine, and that's how it keeps the engine cool. To start one of these engines, you're familiar probably with pulling a cord. This is called a recoil starter. Okay, so starting to see some cool stuff in there, the flywheel in there. Anyway, first, this is the recoil starter. We just talked about that. You pull that. So if you look at the back, you pull this. You see that? There's these little plates that come out. So you pull this, those come out. They grab onto these little slots in here, and then it'll turn the engine, basically. And when you let it go, they go back in. The thing goes back, winds itself back up. You pull it, they come out. They start turning the engine, turning the engine, turning the engine. Hopefully it starts at that point, and it'll start spinning. These will go back in as you release this. So, of course, the car has a different thing with a motor instead of, you know, pulling a rope. That would be a little difficult to do on a car. But anyway, so now we can start seeing the flywheel here inside. But this is still, this cover is still on here. It's actually called the blower housing. So I mentioned about the air cooling. So it is like a fan in there. The flywheel has blades on it, and it sucks air in from through the ports in here, all those little slots, comes in and blows all the air back over the fins on the engine to keep it cool. Let's see. All right, taking off the blower housing. Oh, getting into interesting stuff now. Oh yes. All right, so here's your blower housing, just really a cover to control where the air flows over the engine. So now you can see some good stuff. Not that the other stuff wasn't good, it was good, but whoa, look at that. I think that was attached to the back of that to cover up, you know, to help cover up. But what's going on here? Okay, so I'm cutting ahead a little here. This thing keeps getting sucked to the flywheel. Anyone know why? Because it's magnetic. And the reason is the engine has a spark plug, which we'll talk about later. And basically the flywheel and this here make a little, basically a little generator that, as this turns, generates spark. There's a coil here to step the voltage up big time to like probably 20,000 volts. But you can really see some interesting good stuff here now. So you got this is the spark plug wire. Pop that off. Here's the spark plug. You probably heard about those. You can see the actual cylinder now, and you got these cooling fins. So now you got, when this flywheel's turning, when that blower housing was on there, it blows the air over those fins out the back, and that cools the engine as it's running. As I mentioned, this is an overhead valve engine, OHV, overhead valve. Oh, by the way, someone's probably watching saying, what's this guy doing wearing gloves? You can't take it? Well, I've been working on these things my whole life. I'm, you know, in my 40s, we'll just say that, which is not that long a life, but it's pretty long. I've had my hands in the bowels of many machines and nasty stuff, and like, you know, you can buy these gloves cheap. It's much easier to, you know, just be done at the end of the day and take them off and be clean. You know, it's not like, you know, wives, girlfriends, boyfriends, whatever, significant others. You know, they don't really appreciate the grease under the fingernails like back in the old days. Yeah, for whatever reasons. That can get weird. All right. So yeah, basically, don't make fun of me for the gloves, all right? It's smart. Okay, all right, yeah, nice. Okay, look. So this is cool, interesting stuff in there now. This is the valve cover, or rocker cover actually, because it's covering what's called rocker arms. So this is the intake port. So this is this is the intake valve down in there. This is the intake rocker arm. This is the exhaust port. So this is the intake valve down in there. This is the exhaust rocker arm. So if I start turning the engine, you'll see, well, okay, let's see. You'll see that intake valve opening and closing. And then you'll see the exhaust valve opening and closing. So I'll explain all that later, but basically you got a rocker arm and it's pushing on a valve. The valve's down in here. And you have a push rod that's pushing up from down on the bottom. So somewhere down in here is what's called the camshaft. So we'll see all that in a little bit. Before we take the cylinder head off, I'm going to take off the spark plug just to kind of show you that. Okay, so this is the spark plug, the famous, very famous device. Look at that thing. That's what they're always talking about. Need new spark plugs. This is it. So the spark plug wire goes on here, and when the spark is sent, it's high voltage. It's high voltage because if you have a high enough voltage, an arc can jump across, electrical arc. So basically the electricity will jump from that little centerpiece called the electrode, and it will jump over to this tab here, which is grounded. So it jumps across there, and you might hear about gapping a spark plug. So if you look really close in there, you can see there's a space between the electrode in the top there. So there has to be a certain size. If it's too big, the spark won't jump across. If it's too small, it'll jump across so easily that it won't be bright and hot enough to light off the fuel air mix. Anyway, I'm going to take off the cylinder head now, and we'll get to see some more stuff. Anyway, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 cylinder head bolts. So I loosened this one. So I don't want to just like loosen this one. I usually go opposite and then like that. And same when you're tightening. But it's more important when you're tightening. But anyway, I like to do it when loosening too, or it's advisable anyway. So that way, especially, you know, not saying, but if you got something cheap, it's certainly better to do that kind of thing. Well, it's cheap or good, you should do it. It's getting exciting. I'm actually not kidding. I am excited. Excited to see the inside. The first time, it's like, I don't know how to explain it. It's like the first time, well, if you're old enough, first time you get to see stuff that's usually covered. How's that? In case there's kids watching. Thoroughly boring. This guy's great at undoing bolts. Here we go. I hope. Oh, yeah, there we go. Nice. Oh, there goes a push rod. All right, here we go. There's the piston. This is a head gasket. This is the head gasket. You ever had? He blew a head gasket, man. This is it right here, and that basically means that. Oh, look at that. The machining is not so great, or something got out of whack. Something got warped, and gas leaked out, or was over pressurized somehow, and it blew out the side. That's blowing a head gasket. Yeah, and the piston you actually can't really see much. There it goes, down and up, down and up, down and up. Oh, and what did I mention about the push rod? So the push rod, this is the push rod. These just like kind of fell out, which is expected. So remember we looked before, just moments ago. So hopefully, geez, I hope you remember that. At these rocker arms and the valves down in there, and there's push rods, and those so if you look sideways at this, you see that rod, this rod, it pushes on those rocker arms. See, and it goes down inside. Let's see if you can see that. Inside the engine, there's a hole. There's 2 holes, one for each push rod, and there's a camshaft down in there. There might be what's called lifters too. I'm not sure on this engine. We'll find out later. But basically, there's a camshaft down in there that pushes these up and down. Yeah, so we'll get to see that later. But so these push rods push the valves open and close. And what are the valves? Oh yeah, let's see them. So remember we took off the cylinder head like this, and if you flip that over, you can see the valves in here. So this is an intake valve that's on the intake side. This is the exhaust valve that's on the exhaust side. You remember that. This is where our carburetor was before. And you always know, basically, the intake valve is larger than the exhaust valve. And then you can see also the spark plug in here. I put that back in there so you can see that. So this, of course, flips back over. And now we can look at the cycle. All right, so if you look at it now, all right, just imagine this is flipped back over this way. Normally those push rods would be coming out of there and going in there and pushing the rocker arms to make the valves open and close. So if you look at this here, imagine that's on top. Right now the piston's at what's called top dead center, and it's going to start on its way down for the intake stroke. And when that happens, this valve here, the intake valve, will open. And you can see I can move it with my finger a little bit, but you know, even these little springs on this little engine are pretty hard to push. So this valve will open, meaning it'll come out a little bit, and the piston will move down, creating a void so that fuel and air mixture can go in through the intake port, past the valve, down and fill into the cylinder there. And then the valve will close, and then the piston will start coming back up in what's called the compression stroke. As the name implies, it compresses the fuel and air mixture into a really, really tight space right here, just basically the space between the top of this and this little small space. And at that point, it's under high pressure. The temperature's risen a lot as well, just because it got compressed, which we can talk about during one of our nerd level discussions later. But basically, everything's squeezed real tight, and the tighter you can squeeze it, that's good for more power or more efficiency. And then at that point, the spark plug goes off, and then it's going to ignite the fuel air mixture, and the piston's gonna go down on what's called the power stroke, because this is the only stroke where all that stuff we did to bring that air and fuel mix in through the carburetor, all that, making the spark plug work, that's all resulting in power for this one stroke. So this is going to drive the piston down to the bottom. It reaches the bottom, and now this exhaust valve is going to open, and the piston will come back up for the exhaust stroke, and that pushes all the the burned mix out of the exhaust, past the valve, out the exhaust port, into the muffler, and that's your blah. That's the sound you're going to hear coming out when that's going on. And now we're at the top again, and the fuel valve's going to open, and the whole thing starts over again. So again, that was fuel valve opens, piston goes down for the intake stroke, fuel valve closes, piston comes up for the compression stroke, squeezes everything real tight into a tiny little space, spark plug goes off, igniting the fuel air mixture. Of course, it's going to expand really rapidly and drive the piston down for the power stroke. And then the piston will stop and come back up. The exhaust valve will open, and the piston coming up drives the exhaust gas out. And that's it. That was the 4 strokes. 1 down, 1 up, 1 down, 1 up. And what the valves do during that process. So that's why they call it a 4-stroke engine. At some point we'll talk about a 2-stroke engine, which works differently. But you can't really explain it with what we got here because it doesn't have valves. It's a whole nother thing. Anyway, yeah, that's really it. That's the main. That's where all that, all the magic happens. So yeah, let's start looking at some other aspects. I mean, we see the piston going up and down. We see the flywheel turning over here. I've explained this thing called the crankshaft inside. That's translating that up and down to a turning motion, just like your legs on it when you're riding a bicycle. So we can take a look at that, and then we'll also see the camshaft, which drives the push rods, which opens and closes those valves. Thank you.